For more than half a century, the abortion issue has gripped the political discourse of not just the United States, but also numerous other countries around the world. For decades, the debate surrounding this topic has made it perhaps the most divisive issue of our time. My name is Sam Brown, and I'm with Survivors. We at Survivors are dedicated to educating people about the horrors of abortion and persuading people to take a firm stance against it. In this video, I'll be going through the pro-life iceberg, while I'll be examining every nook and cranny of the abortion debate, going from its most well-known to things that only the most invested have any knowledge of. Warning: this video is dedicated to covering a subject which is inherently violent, that being abortion, which involves the destruction of innocent human life. This is especially going to be the case near the end of the video, where things are going to get quite grim. Viewer discretion is advised. Level 1. Roe v. Wade. I think everyone who is familiar with the debates around abortion knows what Roe v. Wade was. After all, it was the case that catapulted abortion to the forefront of American politics. But for those who are not from the United States, or for those who are new to the abortion debate, I'll explain it to you. Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court case that was argued in 1971 and officially decided upon in 1973. Before this, abortion was largely illegal throughout the United States, with elective abortion only being legal in 5 states and it being legal in about a dozen other states in some rare cases. This ruling would completely upend the legal consensus surrounding abortion in America. Before this, it was viewed as an issue that should be best left up to each individual state. However, with the Roe decision, every single state was forced to legalize abortion up until the supposed point of viability, which has gotten earlier and earlier thanks to advances in biomedical technology. It declared that abortion was somehow protected under a supposed right to privacy in the 9th Amendment and in the 14th Amendment. Critics have pointed out numerous flaws in this ruling. For starters, the word abortion is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. And under the 10th Amendment, all issues not expressly addressed in the Constitution are, quote-unquote, reserved to the states respectively or to the people, at least in theory. In addition to that, others, including survivors, would argue that legalized abortion actually violates the 14th Amendment, because when a state is allowing for the killing of innocent preborn children through abortion, it is stripping these persons of their life and liberty without any due process of law whatsoever. While the legality of abortion was still an issue before the Roe v. Wade decision, this SCOTUS ruling lit a fire underneath both pro-abortion and anti-abortion activists. For the next 50 years, abortion would be treated as a constitutional right. That is, until Dobbs v. Jackson. Other than Roe v. Wade, Dobbs v. Jackson is probably the most well-known Supreme Court case regarding abortion. And like with Roe, if you know anything about the abortion debate in this country, you've heard of Dobbs. But for those who are unaware, Dobbs v. Jackson is a much more recent Supreme Court case, which was argued in 2021 and decided upon the following year. This case officially overturned Roe v. Wade, with a majority of justices ruling that abortion was not a constitutional right. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding Dobbs. It did not outlaw abortion nationwide, and it instead allowed for each state to write its own abortion laws. On the face of it, this seems like an ideal solution. But when you remember that under Dobbs, states like Vermont, Minnesota, and Colorado are allowed to remove virtually all restrictions on abortion, you begin to realize that this is a lot less than ideal. Truly, justice will not prevail until we are able to abolish abortion in every single state. Catholic social teaching. Alright, now we're going to be verging into different faith-based arguments against abortion. The first comes from Catholic social teaching. The Catholic Church is well known for its consistent opposing of abortion in all its forms. And unlike what some might try to tell you, this isn't a recent phenomenon. The first church document to officially condemn abortion was written as far back as the 1st century. This document is known as the Didache, and it says, quote-unquote, "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill them when born." In addition to that, it says in paragraph 2271 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church that, quote, "Since the 1st century, the Church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law." I mean, it doesn't get any clearer than that. As a Catholic myself, I must say that I am proud that my church has stood on the side of human life for thousands of years. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that everyone who self-identifies as Catholic is pro-life, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Exceptions for rape. This is referring to the belief that some quote-unquote moderates on abortion have, where they think that elective abortion should be outlawed, but there should still be exceptions for cases involving rape and incest. This belief is held by the Mormon Church and was supported by former Arizona Senator and presidential candidate John McCain. On the face of it, this seems like a compelling argument. However, it becomes a lot less compelling when you take several factors into account. For one, a preborn child that was conceived in rape is no less valuable than one who is conceived by a loving mother and father. In addition to that, many would argue that allowing for abortion in these cases actually aids rapists and human traffickers, who are able to forcefully dispose of the strongest evidence of their crimes. 15-week limit. The idea of a 15-week limit is one that has been floated by some U.S. politicians, mainly on the Republican Party. This would allow for abortions in the first trimester of a pregnancy, but would ban it after the first few weeks of the second trimester at the 15-week mark, making late-term abortions illegal. This would not be an ideal solution for the abortion problem, as the vast majority of abortions take place in the first trimester, and a person's a person no matter how small, so abortion in the first trimester is still murder. Speaking of which, life begins at conception. Life begins at conception is one of the most common phrases seen in the pro-life movement. What this refers to is the idea that human life, and thus human rights, begin when a sperm fertilizes an egg. The vast majority of biologists agree with this view, with 96% of biologists agreeing that human life begins at fertilization, or what we would call conception. However, many pro-abortion activists will still say that while some form of human life might begin at conception, quote-unquote personhood doesn't begin until much later in the pregnancy. This is a pretty fallacious argument, as it presupposes that you can somehow divorce personhood from life. Let me tell you something. Every time that this playbook has been used in human history, it has led to countless crimes against humanity, and abortion is no different. All 9 months. The phrase all 9 months refers to how in the states of Vermont, New Jersey, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, Colorado, Oregon, and Alaska, there are no real restrictions on abortion. This, in effect, allows for abortion to take place throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. This means that a baby that could most certainly survive outside the womb could have its life brutally destroyed as it's on the brink of being born. This is one of the most barbaric aspects of legal abortion in this country. This practice has been endorsed by numerous left-wing politicians, including Tim Walz and Gretchen Whitmer. My body, my choice. Along with life begins at conception, my body, my choice is perhaps the most common slogan used in abortion discourse around the world. The idea behind this is that a preborn child is a part of its mother's body, no different from a kidney or an appendix. As such, pro-aborts like to argue that since an unborn child is no more than an appendage of its mother, this means that the woman has every right to quote-unquote terminate the pregnancy, or really just kill her child. This argument is completely asinine, as a preborn child is not merely an organ of their mother. A preborn child has its own DNA and is in fact its own person. Allowing for abortion does not protect the bodily autonomy of anyone. In fact, it actually violates the bodily autonomy of the preborn child, as it allows for them to be violently murdered. The March for Life. Now we're going to move on from talking points to major pro-life events. Specifically, we'll be talking about the March for Life, probably the biggest anti-abortion event of the year in the United States. It has taken place every January since 1974, roughly marking the anniversary of the Roe decision. On average, attendance at the March for Life is usually in the tens of thousands. Before the march begins, there's a rally that usually takes place at either the Ellipse or the National Mall. Some notable speakers at this rally have included Congressman Chris Smith, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, Vice President J.D. Vance, who spoke at the march this year, and Donald Trump, who in 2020 became the first U.S. president to speak in person at the march. I actually have a funny story from my first March for Life. So, I went to the march for the first time back in 2024, and I actually live in the D.C. area. And I originally wasn't planning on going to the March for Life that week, but it snowed quite hard the night before, so school got canceled that Friday. And since you could still take the metro to go into D.C., I ended up deciding at the last minute to go to the march of my church. Now, when I actually arrived at the march, I got separated from them almost immediately, but that's a story for another time. JFK was pro-life. The phrase JFK was pro-life is another talking point that is often repeated by conservatives to argue that JFK was more socially conservative than his party in the modern day. Now, this is true, as JFK was officially opposed to abortion. However, I believe that this needs several caveats. For one, this was in the early 1960s, when the vast majority of Americans rightly thought that killing an unborn child through abortion was a horrid crime. And this was especially the case for Catholic Americans. However, after the Roe decision was handed down, many members of the Kennedy dynasty, most notably Ted Kennedy, became turncoats and switched from being pro-life to being pro-abortion. In addition to that, JFK was well known for having numerous affairs both before and during his presidency, and infidelity is one of the leading causes of abortion. So if JFK had not gone to Dallas on that fateful day in November of 1963, there's reason to suspect that he could have flipped sides years down the road. Level 2. Norma McCorvey. Almost everyone involved in the abortion debate knows about Roe, but few people know about the woman who instigated it in the first place. Her name was Norma McCorvey. She grew up in Louisiana and Texas and had a troubled upbringing, causing her to get pregnant 2 times before turning 21. When she got pregnant for a third time, she falsely tried to claim that she had been gang raped by a group of black men in order to obtain an abortion. However, since there was no evidence for this, she was not able to kill her unborn baby. As a result, she teamed up with several lawyers to sue the state of Texas in federal court, and the rest is history. What many people don't know about McCorvey is that she would go on to regret her involvement in the legalization of abortion. In 1995, she was baptized, and she would go on to convert to Catholicism several years later. Just a couple days after her baptism, she renounced abortion and would work with pro-life groups for the next 2 decades. Now, some pro-aborts have tried to argue that McCorvey was bribed into becoming pro-life, and that her activism was all an act. However, Frank Pavone, who knew her for 22 years and helped receive her into the Catholic Church, and had spoken with her on the day that she died, would argue to the contrary. There's also Abby Johnson, who we'll talk about later, who actually got a call from Norma McCorvey just a couple days later, where she expressed remorse at her being pro-abortion for so many years. Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Another major figure in the legalization of abortion in the United States was Margaret Sanger. Sanger would found the American Birth Control League, which would later go on to rename itself to what we now know as Planned Parenthood. One of the main reasons why she was so devoted to the proliferation of contraception and abortion was due to her strong support of eugenics. Eugenics is the idea that people are only worth the sum of their genes, and that some people, usually disabled people and people of color, are so, quote, unfit that they should not be able to reproduce. She described intellectually disabled people, or as she called them, the quote-unquote feeble-minded, as being a biological menace. She did not believe that disabled people should have the same basic human rights as the able-bodied. Instead, she believed that they should be segregated and forcefully sterilized. Another group that she targeted in her writings were Black Americans, who she saw as being much more likely to produce quote-unquote defective children. Some of Sanger's friends and colleagues include Lothrop Stoddard, a prominent white supremacist writer who was admired by Adolf Hitler. For more information on Sanger and her wretched beliefs, I would highly recommend the movie The 1619 Project. Abortion as birth control. This is in reference to a certain opinion that some pro-abortion people hold. According to this minority faction of pro-aborts, abortion is morally permissible in instances where contraception fails or when the kind of traumatic crimes that we talked about earlier take place, but they still consider abortion immoral if it's being used as quote-unquote birth control. In their eyes, this happens when people deliberately avoid using contraception and sleep around because they think that abortion is a get-out-of-parenthood free card. Now, obviously, this kind of behavior is incredibly irresponsible and should always be avoided, but the thing is, the idea that abortion is only wrong when it's being used as quote-unquote birth control just makes no sense. This is because, simply put, all abortion is in some form a way of birth control. The whole point of an abortion is to stop a pregnancy and kill the unborn child in the process. The whole point of an abortion is to control birth. You can't avoid that obvious fact. In addition to that, whether a couple was using contraception or not is frankly irrelevant to the issue at hand. No matter the circumstances of its conception, a preborn child will always be a human being with the right to life. Abortion is murder when it's being used as quote-unquote birth control, and it's still murder when it's being used as a failsafe. Consistent life ethic. The consistent life ethic is, like Catholic social teaching, another major school of thought within the pro-life movement. This is the idea that people who self-identify as pro-life should be consistent in opposing all actions and policies that pose a threat to human life. Generally speaking, this means that people with a consistent life ethic are not only opposed to abortion, but are also strongly opposed to unjust war and the death penalty. You'll also sometimes see people with this worldview add in concepts like universal healthcare and environmentalism to this philosophy. This line of thinking is promoted by groups like Rehumanize International. Now, some people from within the pro-life movement criticize this line of thinking because they believe that this treats all of these issues as if they were all the same. Overall, I would say that both sides of the debate have good points. On one hand, everything that destroys innocent human life is wrong and should be combated, but on the other hand, I do believe that some issues like abortion are really much bigger problems and kill much more people than, say, something like the death penalty. And there are also people who are anti-abortion who argue that the death penalty is justified because it only kills people who are guilty of murder and other vicious crimes, but that's a story for another time. Pro-choice Christians. Alright, next up are quote-unquote pro-choice Christians. These are, as you would guess with a name like that, self-identified Christians who support legal abortion. As it stands, several major Protestant denominations are in favor of abortion being legal. And these include the Presbyterian Church USA and the Episcopal Church. Now, this can mean different things to different people. Some Christians might support legal abortion because, well, they might personally think that abortion is wrong. They also think that they shouldn't force their beliefs on people and shouldn't have their religious views legislated upon. And then, on the other hand, you'll have some people who will swear up and down that they're Christians, and then, in the same breath, will talk about how abortion is somehow a human right. And how an abortion is no different than any other quote-unquote medical procedure. The latter is obviously morally obtuse, but there are also plenty of problems with the former. The idea that Christians should support legal abortion being legal because they shouldn't force their beliefs on other people is terribly flawed. For one, abolishing abortion is far different than forcing people to go to church on every Sunday, because you don't have to be a Christian to oppose abortion. Also, think about the slavery. Virtually all abolitionists were devout Christians who believed that outlawing slavery was their duty as followers of Jesus Christ. Was it wrong for them to, quote-unquote, force their religious view that all men are created equal and that human beings should not be bought and sold as property? No, I don't think so. Abortion RX. This is in reference to the use of pills in order to kill preborn children via abortion. This comes from a 2-pill regimen. The first pill used in a chemical abortion is mifepristone, also known as RU-486. This pill, when taken by a pregnant woman, kills her unborn baby by starving it to death and depriving it of the nutrients that it needs to survive. When this process is finished, the woman will then take a second pill called misoprostol, and this expels the body of the deceased preborn child. Thankfully, it is possible to reverse mifepristone, and if you know anyone who took the first abortion pill, please tell them about the Abortion Pill Reversal Hotline. The number for the Abortion Pill Reversal Hotline is 1-877-558-0333. Now, despite what groups like Planned Parenthood might tell you, there are multiple health risks to using RU-486. If a woman takes the abortion pill and she has an ectopic pregnancy, or she takes it too late in the pregnancy, her life could be put in jeopardy. Lila Rose. Now, we're going to be talking about one of the most prolific anti-abortion activists in the United States, Lila Rose. At the age of only 15, she helped found Live Action, one of the best pro-life groups out there. So it goes to show you that you can always contribute to the pro-life movement, no matter how old you are. Anyway, during her years as a young adult, she would go on multiple undercover operations around the Los Angeles area. As a result of these sting operations, she managed to uncover that Planned Parenthood was circumventing the law and allowing for abortions to be performed on victims of statutory rape without filing a police report. To this day, she still serves as the president of Live Action and is one of the most followed pro-life content creators online. The FACE Act. Alright, next up we're going to be talking about one of the worst pro-abortion laws in this nation's history. To just show you how bad this law is and how much it criminalizes peaceful pro-life activists, my friend Jeff White, who's actually the founder of Survivors and has been deeply invested in this movement for decades, once said this about the FACE Act. He said, quote, if there was anything like the FACE Act during the Civil Rights Movement, we would still be drinking out of segregated drinking fountains. That just goes to show you how much this law has hampered the movement to abolish abortion in this country. Alright, so what's the FACE Act? The Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act is a federal law signed by President Bill Clinton in May of 1994. This law, which was supported and co-sponsored by members of both parties, makes it a felony for someone to block an entrance to an abortion facility. This means that, under this law, you could end up spending up to 10 years in federal prison for simply blocking the door to an abortion mill. This was written in response to a group called Operation Rescue, which we'll talk about later. This group would go around the country and blockade abortion clinics in order to prevent women from killing their preborn babies inside, and this law was directly designed to hamper them. Unplanned. Next up is one of the most notable pro-life pieces of media out there, and that is the movie Unplanned. For those who don't know, Unplanned is a 2019 drama film detailing the life of Abby Johnson, a woman who was an employee at Planned Parenthood before she left and became an anti-abortion activist. In the movie, it details how she initially got involved with Planned Parenthood in college before she worked as the clinic director for a Planned Parenthood facility in Bryan, Texas for 8 years, and how she would ultimately abandon the abortion industrial complex after she witnessed an abortion via ultrasound. The movie was produced by PureFlix, and is the only PureFlix film to have received an R rating from the MPAA, due to several scenes of graphic abortion-related violence. This was actually quite controversial, as figures like Mike Huckabee and Glenn Beck alleged that this was a political move meant to target the movie for being anti-abortion. Overall, the film was received well by its target audience of Christians and pro-lifers, but was negatively received by secular critics, who often argued that it was a propaganda film. Silent Scream documentary. Speaking of movies, the next topic up on this iceberg is the 1984 documentary known as Silent Scream. This documentary, which lasts for less than 30 minutes, depicts a surgical abortion being performed on a preborn child via ultrasound and details the amount of agony and suffering it has to go through before finally dying. This documentary was narrated by Bernard Nathanson, a former abortionist who abandoned the abortion industrial complex. The film spread like wildfire across the country and was aired on major television networks several times. It galvanized the pro-life movement and was used as a major tool of persuasion to convince people to take the side of the pro-life movement. Let me tell you something. In my experience as a pro-life activist, whenever I've asked older activists from the boomer generation about what got them to be involved in the movement, Silent Scream was almost always brought up. Pro-choice. Alright, this one's going to be a little different from the last two. The term pro-choice is a derogatory term used by pro-lifers to describe men who are pro-abortion. Now, I would say that there are two types of men who fall into this category. The first are men who are pro-abortion because it's something that they genuinely believe in. They've been philosophically convinced that there's nothing wrong with abortion, and while that's obviously not a good thing, I would say that the second group of pro-choice men is far worse. I'm referring to men who might understand why abortion is wrong, but then still support abortion because they think that it advances their personal interests. What I mean by this is that these men believe that if abortion remains legal, it will be easier for them to sleep around with women, or alternatively, they think that if they openly oppose abortion, it will be harder for them to get a girlfriend. And I must say, these guys are frankly just stone-cold losers. If you're willing to put your morals and your conscience aside to get a girlfriend, you should be single for the rest of your life. Level 3. Justice for the Five. Alright, moving on to the next layer of this iceberg, Justice for the Five is an ongoing pro-life campaign based out of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The goal of this campaign is to permanently shut down the Washington Surgery Clinic, revoke the medical license of Cesare Santangelo, the chief abortionist there, and for the D.C. police to conduct a full investigation into the potential crimes committed there. What are these crimes exactly? Well, there's unfortunately a lot of terrible things that have happened at this particular abortion mill, some of which we'll be talking about later in the video when we're talking about Cesare Santangelo. But for this section, we will be specifically talking about the DC-5. Now, this whole situation started back in 2022, when two pro-life activists, Teresa Bukivanak and Lauren Handy, were sidewalk counseling outside of this abortion mill in Foggy Bottom. when they suddenly saw a medical waste truck from Curtis Bay Medical Waste Service. They approached the truck driver and told him that he was most likely carrying the bodies of murdered preborn children. He was horrified by this revelation, and when the two activists requested that he handed over the remains so that they could be given a funeral and a burial, he obliged. They rushed back to Lauren Handy's apartment, and when they opened these boxes, the situation turned out to be far worse than they had imagined. In total, there were 115 murdered preborn children inside of this box. Out of these 115, 110 were first trimester abortion victims, who would go on to be buried in a private cemetery. And to their horror, 5 of them were second and third degree premature infants. And because of their size, development, and wounds, it appeared that 3 out of 5 of these were born alive and killed. With this being a potential violation of federal law, Teresa and Lauren both asked their lawyers to send a letter to the police asking for the remains to be picked up and investigated. That same day, Lauren Handy was arrested by the FBI in connection to a rescue operation that she had supposedly conducted 2 years prior. I don't know about you, but that sounds like an obvious attempt at a cover-up. Now, unfortunately, the DC police have failed to conduct a full investigation into what happened here, but this movement still lives on. This summer, several of our activists at Survivors actually went out to DC as a part of our mission house. To learn more, you can listen to our podcast here. Disability-based abortion. Disability-based abortion is one of the most malignant types of abortion out there. This is what happens when a preborn child is diagnosed with some kind of disability through the use of prenatal screening, and then is targeted to be murdered through abortion as a result. The most common example of this can be found in the astonishingly high rate of abortion among preborn children with Down syndrome. In the United States, somewhere between 60 to 90% of all preborn children who are given a Down syndrome diagnosis are killed through abortion. And it's even worse in other countries. In Denmark, universal prenatal screening was introduced in 2004, and as a result, the number of children in the country born with Down syndrome has dramatically declined. In 2019, it was reported that only 18 children in the country of almost 6 million were born with Down syndrome, as the rest of their cohort was systematically slaughtered before they could even have a chance to succeed in life. And Denmark isn't even the worst offender when it comes to this kind of violent systemic ableism. That title would have to go to Iceland, where virtually all preborn children who are given a diagnosis of Down syndrome are killed through abortion. One thing that's particularly offensive about this whole thing is that whenever you read about this online, most of the outlets that report on it make it seem like Iceland has somehow cured Down syndrome. In reality, they haven't done that at all. Really, all they've done is sentence every preborn child with the wrong chromosomes to death. Malthusian abortion. Thomas Malthus was perhaps the earliest major advocate for population control, at least in the West. He was an English economist and demographer, and in 1798 he published his most well-known writing, An Essay on the Principles of Population. In this work, he argues that while population grows at an exponential rate, essential resources, especially food, only grow at a linear rate. According to Malthus, this leads to a major imbalance, which leads to famine, disease, and poverty. This idea, the idea that overpopulation is a chronic societal problem that will inevitably lead to disaster, began to spread like wildfire across the Western world. And while Malthus himself actually condemned using abortion as a method of population control, more than a century later, readers of his works would use fears of overpopulation to justify mass-scale abortion. Margaret Sanger was quite influenced by Malthus and believed that the proliferation of birth control was the only way to stop a supposed population crisis. The biggest example of neo-Malthusianism would have to be the 1968 book, The Population Bomb. In this book, its author, Paul Ehrlich, argues that a quote-unquote population explosion would outpace agricultural yields so much that it would lead to worldwide famines, including in developed Western countries. In his book, Ehrlich argues that nations should legalize abortion and expand sex ed in order to prevent said population crisis. Soon after his seminal work was published, Ehrlich would go on to found the group Zero Population Growth, which is now known today as population connection. Now, if you couldn't tell already, the vast majority of the predictions made by these neo-Malthusians have turned out to be false. The supposed worldwide famines turned out to never materialize anywhere outside of the poorest, most desolate regions of the world that already had long histories of food insecurity. In fact, in many countries around the world, the opposite problem is taking place. In every major developed country outside of Israel, the birth rate is below 2.0, or below replacement level. In South Korea, this is an especially bad problem, as the birth rate there currently stands at 0.78. Because of this, it is expected that in 50 years, the population of South Korea will be half of what it is now. So not only does abortion kill unborn children and harm women, but also inflicts deep damage upon entire societies. Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act. Unfortunately, our federal government has done little in terms of legislation to protect preborn children, but one proposed law that would remedy that is the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act. If passed, this law would make it illegal for a doctor to fail to provide medical care for an infant that is born alive from an abortion attempt. This bill was originally introduced by Congressman Trent Franks of Arizona on September 3rd, 2015. It passed by a large margin in the House, but unfortunately died in the Senate. In the near decade since then, the bill has been reintroduced 5 times, with it usually dying in committee. The most recent attempt to reintroduce the bill came when Congresswoman Ann Wagner of Missouri introduced it as H.R. 21 on January 3rd, 2025, right as the 119th Congress was starting out. Unlike many of its previous iterations, it managed to not only get out of committee, but also pass through the House of Representatives. It has been referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and if it makes it through that, it will then be voted on by the entire Senate. Randall Terry. Randall Terry is one of the most notable pro-life activists in the United States. Beginning in the 1980s, Terry founded Operation Rescue, which focused on nonviolent direct action against abortion mills. In 1986, he was arrested for the first time after he chained himself to a sink inside of an abortion mill. In the decades since then, he has been arrested an additional 48 times, with almost all of those convictions being for similar instances of peaceful pro-life activism. In addition to that, he and several other anti-abortion activists were also sued by the National Organization of Women, a pro-abortion group which caused him to declare bankruptcy and lose most of his property. He has run for public office several times. The first time was in 1998, when he ran for New York's 26th Congressional District. He would lose the Republican primary, but would still be on the ballot for the general election as the candidate of the New York Right to Life Party, and would end up with 7% of the vote. In 2006, he would run for the Florida State Senate against James E. King after he opposed legislation to extend the life of Terri Schiavo, if you're familiar with that case. Unfortunately, Terry would again lose in the Republican primary. 6 years later, Terry would run for president as a Democrat, using his presidential candidacy in order to bring awareness to the horrors of abortion. He would actually get second place in the Oklahoma primary behind none other than President Obama. In 2024, he would run for president again, this time as the candidate for the Constitution Party. His 2024 campaign would be similar to his 2012 campaign, in that it would be less about winning the White House and more about exposing the American public to the atrocities of the abortion industrial complex. Some Republicans have accused Terry of being part of some Democrat plot to split the vote for Trump, and I would strongly disagree with that take. If you go out and watch any of his ads, he isn't even telling you to vote for him. He's telling you to vote against Kamala Harris and other pro-abortion candidates. So to say that he was splitting the vote and that he was some kind of Democratic Party asset is just plain silly in my opinion. Oh, and by the way, he did this one skit with a couple of pro-life activists a while back. Let's all watch it.
I need your money to kill babies by abortion. You, taxpayer, give me your money to pay for baby killing.
No, I don't believe in abortion.
I don't care. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give me money to kill babies.
All right, I'll pay you. Don't hit me anymore. Please, kill my baby. Kill my baby.
You, kill that woman's baby. Yes.
Pretty awesome, am I right? Abortion in Judaism. Alright, our next two entries on this iceberg will focus on how non-Christian religions view the issue of abortion. While Christianity and different Christian churches are often at the center of the abortion debate, the views of other religions are often disregarded. First off is abortion in Judaism. Unlike in Christianity, where most Orthodox churches are opposed to abortion, the same cannot be said about Judaism. In terms of theology and philosophy, there is a wide scope of debate from within the Jewish community. On one hand, you have Reform Judaism, which is generally pro-abortion and argues that restrictions on abortion violate women's agency. In fact, there was actually one synagogue in Palm Beach County that sued the state of Florida after DeSantis signed a law banning abortion after 15 weeks, with their chief rabbi, Barry Silver, arguing that banning abortion was quote-unquote not Jewish and not humane. However, that obviously isn't the only point of view within the Jewish religion. On the other hand, you'll find Orthodox Judaism, which is very anti-abortion. Under Orthodox Judaism, abortion is only permitted in instances where the mother's life is being threatened, which many people within the pro-life community don't even consider as an abortion. In Israel, all of the Orthodox political parties, including Shas, United Torah Judaism, the National Religious Party, Noam, and Otzma Yehudit, all take a hardline stance against elective abortion. And while Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism both generally agree with the Talmudic notion that a fetus is not considered a life until 40 days post-gestation and not a fully fledged human being until birth, Orthodox Judaism would hold that a preborn child after 40 days post-gestation is still a potential life and deserving of protection. Abortion in Islam. Alright, now that we're finished talking about abortion in Judaism, we will now be talking about abortion in Islam. Like in Islam, there are several different schools of thought regarding the issue of abortion. However, there is a widespread consensus on some types of abortion. For example, virtually all major Islamic schools of thought are opposed to late-term abortion, or more specifically, to any abortion that takes place after 120 days post-gestation. However, there are some groups within Islam that believe that first-trimester abortions are morally allowable, while groups like the Zahirites and Malachites are entirely opposed to abortion at any stage of pregnancy. As for Islamic countries, the vast majority of them have completely outlawed elective abortion, and most of the majority Muslim countries that allow for elective abortion are former Soviet bloc states. However, some Muslim countries do allow for abortion in cases of rape and especially fetal abnormality, with places like Kuwait and Iran allowing it up to 4 months post-gestation for cases of severe fetal abnormality. Democrats for Life of America. Alright, now we're going to take a break from talking about religion and go back to everyone's favorite subject of discussion, politics. So, as most people who are familiar with U.S. politics will know, the Democratic Party is, largely speaking, a pro-abortion party. Ever since 1976, the Democratic Party has been officially on the record as supporting legal abortion. Every Democrat president elected since Roe has supported legal abortion to various degrees, and yes, that does include Jimmy Carter. While he did always personally oppose abortion and occasionally criticize his own party for being too extreme on the issue, he had, at least in public, supported legal abortion from his initial presidential campaign in 1976 onward. The last Democratic president, Joe Biden, was notoriously pro-abortion, to the point where his Justice Department threw the book at several peaceful pro-life activists. The last candidate on a Democratic Party presidential ticket to be explicitly anti-abortion was Sargent Shriver, George McGovern's second running mate in 1972. That being said, however, there is an unfortunately small minority of Democrats who rightfully see the barbarism in abortion. Currently, that group is represented by Democrats for Life of America, or DFLA, which holds to the framework of the consistent life ethic. Historically, pro-lifers made up a decent chunk of the Democratic Party. Some notable examples of pro-life Democrats include Congressman Dan Lipinski of Illinois, Senator John Breaux of Louisiana, Governor Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, and Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Most of these elected officials generally hailed from areas that were either predominantly Catholic or from the South. Unfortunately, in the decades since Roe, and especially in the last 5 years, pro-lifers have been increasingly pushed out of the Democratic Party. In 2020, Congressman Dan Lipinski narrowly lost his primary, and later that year, Congressman Colin Peterson of Minnesota would lose re-election, marking 2 major defeats for pro-life Democrats. As of writing, there is only one pro-life Democrat in all of Congress, that being Henry Cuellar of Texas. However, there still continues to be numerous pro-life Democrats in the state legislatures of places like Rhode Island and Louisiana. Pro-abortion Republicans. On the flip side, there are also pro-abortion Republicans. Since Roe was handed down in 1973, the Republican Party has always been at least somewhat opposed to abortion as a whole. However, like with the Democrats, that hasn't stopped there from being renegade Republicans who stand in support of legal abortion. Like with their Democratic colleagues, pro-aborts made up a decent chunk of the Republican Party for quite a while. Privately, Richard Nixon supported abortion in cases of rape or in cases of the mother and father being black and white. Yes, this is an actual thing that President Nixon believed in. You can look it up. Not only that, but every Republican First Lady since Roe has supported legal abortion in some form, and yes, that does include Melania Trump and Nancy Reagan. Examples of prominent historical pro-abortion Republicans include Congresswoman Constance Morella of Maryland, who is actually the chief co-sponsor of the FACE Act, along with Senator Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island, Governor Pete Wilson of California, Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois, and Senator Slade Gorton of Washington. As of writing, there are 2 pro-abortion Republican senators, those being Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. In addition to that, there is 1 Republican member of the House who self-identifies as pro-choice, that being Tom Keene Jr. of New Jersey. And while there aren't too many Republican politicians nowadays who are openly pro-abortion, there is still a large chunk of congressional Republicans who, while they might say that they are pro-life, oppose legislation to abolish abortion nationwide because they feel that it's quote-unquote unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court literally said that the federal government could abolish abortion if it wanted to. These include Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, Senator David McCormick of Pennsylvania, and our current president, Donald J. Trump. One Republican senator, Bob Packwood of Oregon, actually tried to introduce legislation to legalize abortion nationwide before Roe, but those plans would falter after he failed to find any co-sponsors. Not so fun fact, Packwood would later go on to resign from the Senate 20 years later after 10 different women accused him of sexual abuse. Really makes you think, doesn't it? Pro-life libertarians. While most people are aware of what the Republican Party and Democratic Party stand for on abortion, the same can't really be said for the Libertarian Party. For those who aren't familiar with the history of the Libertarian Party, which I imagine is probably almost all of you, let me fill you in. The Libertarian Party was founded late in the year 1971 on a platform of strongly supporting individual rights and dramatically downsizing the government. Specifically, it was founded in response to things like the end of the gold standard under Nixon, the Vietnam War-era military draft, and the wide variety of new welfare programs that were introduced under the Great Society. In its first ever party platform, it says that they hold that the sole function of government is the protection of the rights of each individual, namely 1, the right to life, and accordingly, we support laws prohibiting the initiation of physical force against others. So naturally, you would think that they would support laws outlawing violence against unborn children in the womb, right? No, not really. Later on in the document, there is a section concerning quote-unquote overpopulation. Remember, this is when overpopulation was considered a problem and not a total farce. In it, it reads, quote, "We further support the repeal of all laws restricting voluntary birth control or voluntary termination of pregnancies during the first 100 days. So basically, they were trying to simultaneously support the right to life while also being pro-abortion. Isn't that funny? And so, this pro-abortion status quo would remain for the next several decades. In 1990, the platform's wording would be revised, and while the party still continued to support legal abortion, it also now stood in opposition to taxpayer-funded abortions, saying, quote, "It is particularly harsh to force someone who believes that abortion is murder to pay for another's abortion." That's something, at least. And that makes sense considering they already don't support taxpayer funding for any other kind of medical procedure, much less the kind that tears unborn children to pieces. In 2012, their position on abortion was revised to state that, quote, "Recognizing that abortion is a sensitive issue and that people can hold good faith views on all sides, we believe that government should be kept out of the matter, leaving the question to each person for their conscious consideration." So basically a nicer way of saying that they're pro-abortion. In 2022, however, things finally began to change. That year, the Libertarian Party held its convention in Reno, and it was a major victory for the Mises Caucus, with them being able to install Angela McArdle as the party chair. As a result of this, the entire abortion plank would disappear from the platform. As of now, the Libertarian Party has no solid position on abortion, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a wide variety of opinions on the subject among individual libertarians. On one hand, you have pro-abortion libertarians, such as Ayn Rand and Gary Johnson, who believe that the government has no right to intervene in people's medical decisions, even if those medical decisions involve injecting lethal injection chemicals into a preborn child and then ripping it apart limb from limb. On the other hand, you have pro-life libertarians. I believe the best example of a pro-life libertarian would be Ron Paul, who I actually met on my birthday last year. He was a Texas congressman who actually ran for president as a pro-life libertarian and was a gynecologist for several years. Let me read this excerpt from his book, Liberty Defined. On one occasion in the 1960s, when abortion was still illegal, I witnessed, while visiting a surgical suite as an OB/GYN resident, the abortion of a fetus that weighed approximately 2 pounds. It was placed in a bucket, crying and struggling to breathe, and the medical personnel pretended not to notice. Soon, the crying stopped. This harrowing event forced me to think more seriously about this important issue. That same day, in the OB suite, an early delivery occurred, and the infant born was only slightly larger than the one that was just aborted. But in this room, everybody did everything conceivable to save this child's life. My conclusion that day was that we were overstepping the bounds of morality by picking and choosing who should live and who should die. These were human lives. There was no consistent moral basis to the value of life under these circumstances. Pretty based, if you ask me. Lastly, I'd like to just end this segment by talking about my own experience with libertarians and the abortion issue. I wouldn't call myself a libertarian personally, but I did work for a libertarian organization up until fairly recently, and I have a lot of libertarian friends and have been in a lot of libertarian circles, so I feel that I have some authority on this subject. You know, a lot of conservatives, and a lot of pro-lifers too, they like to caricature all libertarians as being these hardcore objectivists who think that unborn children are parasites, and I just don't think that's true. I think that when it comes to abortion, they're split right down the middle. About half of them are like me and believe that killing an unborn baby violates the non-aggression principle, and the other half are, well, the hardcore objectivists. That's all I have to say. Abortion referendums. Abortion referendums are, as the name suggests, referendums on abortion. For those who aren't as election-obsessed as I am, a referendum is an election voted on by the electorate over one single political question, rather than a normal election that features several different candidates. Abortion referendums, at least nowadays, are one of the most common methods that pro-aborts use to legalize the practice in areas where they've been banned by the legislature. This was the case in the states of Ohio and Missouri, and also in the nation of Ireland. However, this wasn't always the case. Before Roe v. Wade, there were 3 statewide referendums on abortion in the United States, which took place in Washington, North Dakota, and Michigan. Washington was the only state where the pro-abortion side won. In Michigan, the pro-abortion side overwhelmingly lost, even losing Wayne County, where Detroit is located. Lastly, in North Dakota, the pro-life side overwhelmingly won, taking more than 75% of the vote. Kristen Turner. Kristen Turner is one of the most well-known pro-life activists from Generation Z. Originally from rural California, Kristen Turner was actually quite pro-abortion for most of her early life. However, after facing a pregnancy scare after a sexual assault, she came to realize the inherent violence in abortion and would turn to the cause of life. For several years, she worked with POW in San Francisco before she moved to D.C. to work with survivors. We'll be talking about both of these organizations later on in the ICEBERG. While she originally began her activism as a pro-life atheist, she has since converted to Catholicism. She is also a singer and songwriter and has written several songs about the Justice for the Five case. Now, maybe I might be a little biased since I'm actually good friends with her, but I genuinely believe that she's among the top pro-life activists of our time. She's proven to be an effective fighter for unborn children in some of the most pro-abortion areas of the country. Without her, I don't even know if I would be speaking here today. She's also a very good singer, and I really do think that she could have made a whole career out of that, but thankfully, the Lord moved her to work on this, and we've been blessed to have her in the movement ever since. Abortion in the Soviet Union. Alright, we'll be moving on to our next subject, which will be abortion policy in the Soviet Union. In 1920, the Soviet Union became the first industrialized nation to legalize abortion on request. This was done at the behest of Vladimir Lenin, who I just personally believe to be one of the most frankly evil, despicable, bloodthirsty, anti-Christian figures in all of human history. But that's besides the point. After being temporarily outlawed a decade later, legal abortion would be reintroduced to the USSR under Nikita Khrushchev. Unlike in the West, where abortion is generally viewed as a last resort, abortion was considered to be the main type of birth control in the Soviet Union. This was because less violent forms of contraception, such as condoms, were often scarce and were very low quality. And on top of that, the Soviet Union did nothing to encourage chastity or any kind of restraint when it came to sexual relations. Remember, this is the same country that practiced state atheism and violently destroyed its native church. This led to the rise of what many observers have dubbed as an abortion culture, with the USSR having some of the highest abortion rates in the entire world. In 1957, there were 6.4 million abortions carried out in the country, while there were only 5.5 million live births. If you were conceived in the USSR, you were more likely to be violently torn to pieces and have your remains treated like garbage than to be born alive. Just think about how terrible that was. And that kind of barbarism did not come to an end with the downfall of the Soviet Union. During the first decade of the Russian Federation, the raw number of abortions declined, but that wasn't because the laws or societal norms around abortion had changed at all. That was instead because the pregnancy and fertility rates had both collapsed due to a wide variety of factors. Nowadays, this abortion culture has somewhat been reined in, but is nowhere close to being eliminated. As of writing, abortion is allowed in Russia up until 12 weeks in most cases, and 22 weeks when it comes to things like rape or fetal abnormality. And just for reference, this is what a 12-week-old preborn child looks like. And this isn't exclusively the case in Russia. Almost every former Soviet state allows for elective abortion up until 12 weeks post-gestation. And the only exception to this is Turkmenistan, where it's banned after 5 weeks. Overall, I think Soviet abortion policy was just another example of how much the USSR had a callous disregard for human life. It is estimated that roughly 260 million preborn Soviet children were killed through abortion. That number is higher than the total number of people who lived in the entire Soviet Union for almost all of its history up until the 1980s. And this obviously wasn't the only example of mass murder in the country. This is the same country where millions of people died from being forced to slave away in gulags, with millions continuing to suffer under forced labor up until the final years of the Union. This is the same country where smuggling caviar from the West into the country could get you the death penalty. This is the same country where summary executions by police officers were allowed for several decades, so it should be a surprise to no one that a country that would have no problem with killing people en masse after birth wouldn't have a problem with doing the same to unborn children in the womb. Another thing I'd like to mention is that whenever you're arguing with usually people on the left about this subject, they'll oftentimes say that you can eliminate abortion by adopting all these government programs. And I think that this is the best piece of evidence proving that that isn't really the case. In the Soviet Union, you could get free healthcare, free housing, all that jazz, and yet plenty of people still condemned their children to death in utero. And lastly, since the Soviet Union pretty much had an iron grip over the entire Warsaw Pact, this would often translate into how the governments of the Soviet bloc states would address the issue of abortion. Which brings us to our next subject. Polish abortion laws. Poland is probably the best example of a country that went from being pro-abortion to largely anti-abortion. Up until 1932, abortion was entirely banned in Poland, mainly due to it being one of the most Catholic countries in all of Europe. Then, when 1932 rolled around, the laws would end up being revised, and abortion was legalized in cases of rape. Polish abortion policy would then change again in 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded. During the more than 5-year-long Nazi occupation of Poland, abortion was legal for Polish women at any point in the pregnancy without any restrictions whatsoever, which we'll talk about more later in the video. Once again, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Anyway, once Nazi Germany came tumbling down, Poland was finally, quote-unquote, liberated by the Soviet Union, or really just put under new management. In 1956, the Polish government, which, as I alluded to earlier, was practically just a Soviet puppet, expanded legal abortion and allowed for it in cases of quote-unquote difficult living conditions, whatever that might be. As the years rolled on, abortion laws in Poland became more and more permissive up until 1989. That year, Poland was again liberated, for real this time, as the Soviet-sponsored satellite government collapsed and free elections were finally allowed to take place. In addition to that, practically all of the numerous restrictions that had been placed on the Catholic Church by the state were lifted. As a result, the pro-life movement in Poland began to take off, and abortion began to be increasingly cracked down upon. In 1993, abortion was restricted to only being allowed in cases of rape, incest, or severe fetal damage. In 2020, protections for unborn children were expanded as the Polish Supreme Court ruled that all preborn children have the right to life regardless of their diagnosis or however they were conceived. But it hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows in Poland. While protections for unborn children continue to expand, the pro-abortion lobby has simultaneously begun to heavily agitate for the liberalization of Polish abortion laws, undoing decades of protections for the country's most innocent. In 2023, Donald Tusk became prime minister on a platform of expanding legal abortion, throwing the pro-life Law and Justice Party out of power. Last year, the Polish parliament was only 3 votes away from fully legalizing abortion. This year, Karol Nawrocki, who is strongly anti-abortion, narrowly won the presidential race against his pro-abortion opponent. In conclusion, the preborn children of Poland are protected under the law. For now. Level 4. Michael New. Michael New is an American political scientist and an associate visiting professor at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His work mainly focuses on anti-abortion legislation and its effects on wider society. He is an associate scholar of the Charlotte Lozier Institute, the research arm of Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. His work is often used by pro-life groups to counteract pro-abortion talking points. Research that he's conducted has proven that things like parental consent laws and prohibiting taxpayer funds for abortion leads to lower abortion rates, rather than other things like contraceptive programs. Progressive anti-abortion uprising. Now, I think everyone watching this video knows that most leftists are pro-abortion, but this isn't always the case. The Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising, or POW, is an American organization dedicated to attacking the abortion industrial complex from the left. Founded in 2021, POW markets itself as a feminist, anti-capitalist, radically inclusive pro-life organization. The group specializes in what they describe as nonviolent direct action against abortion. The group's founder, Teresa Bakivinak, ran for president last year as a pro-life Democrat, and while her campaign unfortunately didn't even come close to winning the nomination, her movement continues today, with a major presence in the pro-life movements in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. New York Right to Life Party. Now, we know that both major political parties have pro-life factions, but what about political parties that are dedicated specifically to abolishing abortion? That's where the New York Right to Life Party comes in. As far as I know, the New York Right to Life Party is the only third party in this country that specifically focuses on the single issue of abortion. The party was founded in 1970 in opposition to the legalization of abortion under Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who we'll be talking about a little later. The party hasn't run candidates of its own since 2002, when it lost ballot access in the state. However, unlike most third parties, the party's electoral strategy didn't solely consist of running their own candidates. Thanks to New York's ballot access laws, they are able to also endorse pro-life candidates from other parties. These include James D. Griffin, the mayor of Buffalo, and Al D'Amato, who is a pro-life Republican who got elected to the United States Senate in 1980 and served for 3 terms. The Rockefellers. So, as I previously mentioned, Nelson Rockefeller would end up signing the Reproductive Health Act into law, making New York the first state in the continental U.S. to legalize elective abortion, and the first in the nation to do so without a residency requirement. Just a couple years later, the New York legislature would actually vote to repeal Rockefeller's loosening of the state's abortion laws, which he would end up vetoing. Soon after that, he would be appointed by Gerald Ford to serve as America's 41st vice president, and it would actually be the last explicitly pro-abortion Republican VP. But the Rockefeller family's connection to the abortion industrial complex and its normalization in American society goes much deeper than that. You see, Nelson Rockefeller had several siblings, and one of those was John D. Rockefeller III. In 1952, shortly before his younger brother's political career would kick-start, John would found the Population Council. While the modern-day organization does not explicitly endorse eugenics as a means of population control, that hasn't always been the case. In 1957, Frederick Osborn was appointed to serve as the president of the Population Council. Before that, he had served as the secretary of the American Eugenics Society. In 1937, he said, quote, "The German sterilization program is apparently an excellent one." Remember, he's talking about a eugenics program where Jews, Poles, and Romanis were all forcibly sterilized by the state in order to curtail their supposed quote-unquote negative traits. After World War II, when America and other countries began to realize just how horrible eugenic practices truly are, Osborn would get to work trying to repackage eugenics in order to distance the pseudoscientific movement from the crimes of the Nazi regime, even though he didn't really have a problem with them. In 1969, Richard Nixon set up a commission to study the effects of population growth on the United States, and this commission would be chaired by none other than John D. Rockefeller III. And Rockefeller, who had already received an award from Planned Parenthood back in 1967, would not be the only pro-abort on this commission. In addition to that, there would also be Charles Westhoff, a supposed quote-unquote Catholic, who tried to convince Catholics of the merits of abortion and eugenics. When this effort failed, he left the church. On March 27, 1972, the commission would send its final report to both the President and the Congress. In it, it recommends that the United States legalizes abortion and removes barriers to contraception. Just a little under a year later, the commission would get what it wanted, and the Roe decision would be handed down. Survivors of the abortion Holocaust. Alright, I've spent more than an hour talking about the pro-life movement, and now I finally get to talk about survivors. We at Survivors of the Abortion Holocaust, often shortened to survivors, are anti-abortion activists who are motivated by the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ to end abortion. We were founded in the late 90s after Jeff White left the group Operation Rescue, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. Our group mainly focuses on targeting young people, specifically high school and college students. And this is for a couple reasons. For one, we believe that this demographic is at an increased risk of participating in the killing of unborn children through abortion. In addition to that, we believe that winning over the youth is key to abolishing abortion in this country. We do this through several different tactics. One of our most well-known methods involves us using signs that display the inherent barbarism in abortion, which we call victim imagery. And we'll do this in places with heavy foot traffic, like college campuses, in order to prick the consciousness of the general public and truly show them that abortion is murder. Operation Rescue. Operation Rescue is another American anti-abortion group, and while it still exists to this day, its heyday was in the 1980s, when it was essentially the premier anti-abortion activist group in the country. The group was originally founded by the previously mentioned Randall Terry, with the slogan, "If you believe abortion is murder, act like it." Operation Rescue would spend the next several years being probably the biggest pain in the rear that the abortion industrial complex had ever faced up until that point. The main way they did this was by using sit-in tactics, the same kind that were used during the civil rights movement to protest segregation. Basically, they would get a group of pro-lifers together and have them either block the entrance or chain themselves to an abortion clinic, putting themselves between the abortionist and the baby that was scheduled to die that day. They would gain some attention from the press after they replicated these tactics in Atlanta while the city was hosting the 1988 Democratic Convention. 3 years later, Operation Rescue would organize a mass deployment to Wichita, Kansas. Thousands of anti-abortion activists would descend into the city with the goal of shutting down the infamous abortionist George Tiller. While they weren't able to shut his facility down, they were able to generate tons of publicity, and the sit-ins and demonstrations conducted by Operation Rescue probably saved thousands of preborn children as a result. However, it wouldn't be like this forever. After the signing of the FACE Act into law and several lawsuits from the abortion industrial complex, Operation Rescue would wind down significantly. Ellen McCormack. Ellen McCormack was an anti-abortion activist and presidential candidate. Born to Irish immigrant parents in the Bronx, she would become politically active in 1970, when Nelson Rockefeller signed the legalization of abortion into law. Since both the New York State Republican Party and Democratic Party were pro-abortion at the time, McCormack would help to found the Right to Life Party that year, which we talked about earlier. She would be one of the party's top organizers and would help elect local and state legislatures with the goal of ending legal abortion in New York. In 1975, she would run for president for the first time, entering into the Democratic primary, as at the time the Democratic Party was seen as the political home of Northern Catholics such as herself. When she entered into the presidential primary, basically all polling showed that she had little to no chance of taking the nomination. But for Ellen, this wasn't about gaining political power and winning an election. Her presidential campaign was, above all else, about awakening America to the horrors of abortion and gaining momentum for the pro-life movement. She would become the first female presidential candidate to receive federal funds from the FEC, allowing her to air anti-abortion commercials across the country. These ads would be viewed by tens of millions of people. For a single-issue pro-life candidate in an increasingly pro-abortion political party, she would do surprisingly well. She got hundreds of thousands of votes from 18 states. She would receive 9.4% of the vote in Vermont, 7.8% of the vote in South Dakota, and 6% in New Jersey, outperforming 3 U.S. senators and 2 governors. 4 years later, she would run for president again, this time as a third-party right-to-life candidate. Like with her bid for the Democratic nomination, this is much less about winning the White House and much more about garnering support for the outlawing of abortion. She would continue to work for pro-life causes for the next several decades until she died in 2012. Abortion in the Bronx. The Bronx is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City and is home to Yankee Stadium and the Bronx Zoo. Unfortunately, it has one of the highest abortion rates in the United States. According to most recent statistics, about 46% of all preborn children in the Bronx are killed through abortion. That's almost half of all pregnancies in the borough. This is due to a wide variety of factors. For one, the Bronx is located in New York City, which has a long history of legal abortion and pro-abortion sentiment, with Planned Parenthood being founded in the city by Margaret Sanger. The Bronx is also the poorest borough of the city, leading many women to be financially pressured into abortion. Lastly, the Bronx is the least white borough of New York City. As of writing, the Bronx is 56% Hispanic, 33% black, and only 14% white. Black and Hispanic women are often preyed upon by the abortion industrial complex. One particularly grisly statistic is that in New York City, a majority of black preborn babies are killed through abortion. Infanticide in the Far East. Infanticide has a long, dark history among East Asian cultures. This was practiced as the main method of population control in the region, with people in that part of the world at the time believing that too many babies would lead to famines and poverty in a sort of proto-Malthusianism. The methods and targets for infanticide differed from country to country. In Japan, the practice was referred to as mabiki and mainly targeted boys, as girls would instead be married off or sold into prostitution. It would be outlawed in the late 19th century as the country began to modernize, but would see a return during World War II. In China, the main target of infanticide was girls, who were seen as being less valuable than boys in ancient Chinese society. Since many ancient Chinese believed in reincarnation, these parents genuinely thought that they were doing their kids a favor by killing them. Oftentimes, many in ancient China did not even believe that life began at birth, and instead thought that it began at around 6 months after birth. And I thought pro-aborts in America were insane. With infanticide being widely practiced throughout their histories and not criminalized up until relatively recently, this led to there being much more support for abortion than in the Christian West. East Asia has some of the laxest abortion laws in the world, with every country in the region allowing for elective abortion. Vietnam has the highest abortion rate out of any sovereign nation in the world, with 44% of all pregnancies ending in abortion, and preborn baby girls being heavily targeted for sex-selective abortions. Human Life Amendment. The Human Life Amendment is the name of several different proposed amendments to the United States Constitution that would abolish the killing of unborn babies through abortion. Several of these were proposed in the immediate aftermath of Roe v. Wade. The first was proposed by Congressman Lawrence Hogan of Maryland, who introduced it just 1 week after Roe was decided. Over the next decade, several different amendments would be proposed, with some of them outlawing abortion entirely and some of them merely restoring the pre-Roe status quo, where the issue of abortion would be left up to the states. The most notable of these amendments would be known as the Hatch-Eagleton Amendment, sponsored by Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah and Democratic Senator Thomas Eagleton of Missouri. This amendment, if ratified, would have allowed for individual states to outlaw abortion. This would be the only human life amendment that would make it to a floor vote, where it would be voted on by the entire Senate. It would end up failing by a vote of 50 to 49, with 66 votes being needed to meet the constitutional threshold. Since then, no abortion-related constitutional amendments have been introduced in Congress. Catholics for Choice. Catholics for Choice is a pseudo-Catholic renegade group established in 1973 to advocate for legal abortion. If you've been watching the video up until this point, you'll know that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, abortion is declared by the Church to be a universal evil and entirely unjustifiable. So shouldn't everyone who claims to be Catholic be opposed to abortion? Unfortunately, that isn't really the case. This group really doesn't exist in order to spread the gospel and grow the church, but rather to wear the skin suit of the Catholic faith in order to promote abortion. The group struggled in its first decade and only survived by being propped up by other abortion groups and a Unitarian Universalist church. I know, how Catholic of them. They would end up moving down to D.C., where they would get a $75,000 check from the Sunan Foundation, which spent years forcefully sterilizing women in Puerto Rico. Nowadays, the group mainly gets its funds from billionaires like Warren Buffett. And in addition to clearly contradicting basic church teaching, the people in charge of it are barely even Catholic. When Frances Kissling was named as president of the organization, she said that she didn't even identify as Catholic. One whistleblower who used to work for the group said, quote, "When I was involved with Catholics for Choice, I was never aware that any of its leaders attended Mass." In the late 90s, the group would even try to kick the Vatican out of the United Nations for opposing abortion. And in addition to blatantly contradicting church teaching and agitating against the church, the group also has a long history of blatant misogyny. According to another whistleblower, quote, "There was no trust, so much misogyny, racism, sexism, harassment, screaming, ableism, bullying, a non-stop barrage of workplace abuse and violence." On top of that, the group would only offer new mothers who were employed by the organization 6 weeks of paid leave, much less than similar organizations of their size. One employee said that paid maternity leave was, quote, "nearly impossible to use and highly looked down upon." And lastly, to top off the group's long history of agitating against the faith, in 2022, the group would project their logo onto the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in D.C., one of the largest Catholic churches in America. This act was so sacrilegious that it was condemned by even the most liberal voices within the church. The Archbishop of Washington, Gregory Welton, would rightfully compare them to Judas. In conclusion, Catholics for Choice is not Catholic and is a complete sham of an organization. Pardoned pro-lifers. At the beginning of Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States, he would pardon 24 pro-life activists who had been charged with the FACE Act under Joe Biden and imprisoned. Of those 24, 10, including Lauren Handy, were involved in a D.C. rescue operation where they blockaded the Washington Surgery Clinic. I was actually able to meet not just one, but 2 of the activists who were pardoned by Trump. And from what they told me, the conditions they were facing while they were in prison were just terrible. So regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, I think we can all agree that this was a good move. Babies Are Murdered Here. Babies Are Murdered Here is a 2014 documentary directed by Marcus Pittman, which focuses on a group of evangelical Protestants led by Russie Thomas in Central Florida who repeatedly sidewalk counsel outside of a local abortion mill. The documentary currently has 190,000 views on YouTube and was followed up by the sequel, Babies Are Still Murdered Here, which focuses on the larger pro-life movement. God willing, the third movie will be titled Babies Were Murdered Here. Silent Scream, Slayer Song. Alright, so we know about Silent Scream the documentary, but what about Silent Scream the song? Silent Scream is the second track off of the 1988 Slayer album, South of Heaven. It was written by Tom Araya, the band's bassist and frontman, and is probably the most well-known anti-abortion metal song. The song, as the name suggests, is based off the 1984 documentary of the same name. Let's just listen to some of these lyrics.
Silent scream, bury the unwanted child. Beat the dawn, sacrifice the unborn.
Pretty metal, am I right? But seriously, as a guy who's been listening to metal since I was like 12 years old, I felt like I had to include it on the ICEBERG. This is definitely one of my favorite Slayer tracks, and it isn't just because it's anti-abortion. It's a great song all around. Margaret Sanger Center Closure. The Margaret Sanger Center, also known as the Manhattan Health Center, was one of the largest abortion mills in New York City. Located in downtown Manhattan, the facility was opened up in the early 90s and was in operation for around 30 years. That was until the local Catholic community stepped in. Starting about 15 years ago, the Archdiocese of New York began to organize Witness for Life events, where there would be a Eucharistic procession from a local parish to the abortion mill. When the Catholics arrived, they would pray the rosary and host a prayer vigil. This led to a harsh backlash from pro-aborts, and as a result, business plummeted. That, combined with several maintenance issues, led to the facility shutting its doors. This has probably been the greatest victory for the pro-life movement in New York City in recent memory. Level 5. Henry Morgentaler. Most people know what Roe v. Wade was, but almost no one knows about how abortion became legalized in Canada. As Great Britain began to crack down on abortion in the mid-1800s, the Dominion of Canada, one of her chief colonies, began to enact similar laws. For the next century, the killing of unborn children through abortion would largely remain illegal, that being until a particularly perfidious man by the name of Henry Morgentaler stepped in. In 1969, he opened up his abortion mill in Montreal in defiance of the laws set up by both Canada and Quebec. The next year, Montreal police would arrest him. He would appeal his conviction to the Canadian Supreme Court in Morgentaler versus the Queen. However, the Canadian Supreme Court would actually rule in favor of his prosecutors. Morgentaler would then spend several years in jail, but when he was released, he had no interest in changing his ways. He would set up illegal abortion mills in both Ontario and Manitoba. In the former, he would be arrested once again, and once again, he would take his case to the Supreme Court. Unlike the previous ruling in R.V. Morgentaler, the Supreme Court of Canada would rule that Canada's abortion laws were in violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, basically their equivalent to the Constitution. Since then, Canada has had no regulations on abortion whatsoever. A pregnant woman can kill her unborn baby at any point in the pregnancy, regardless of how viable it might be. A preborn child can be killed for any reason in the country, and according to the CBC, there have been numerous instances of forced abortion in Quebec. Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. Now, while Canada might have no restrictions on abortion whatsoever, thankfully the same cannot be said for the United States. Currently, there are several major laws governing abortion in the U.S., with the most notable being the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. For those who aren't aware, partial birth abortion is a particularly gruesome kind of murder in utero, where the preborn child is pulled out of the mother's womb and killed. While the practice was officially banned in the year 2003, this would not be the first attempt at doing such. The first attempt at banning partial birth abortion happened in 1995, when Congressman Charles T. Kennedy of Florida introduced the legislation into the House of Representatives. The bill would pass in both chambers of Congress, but would unfortunately be vetoed by President Bill Clinton, who, as we all know, is a great champion of women who has never harmed a woman at any point in his life. Anyway, Congress attempted to overturn his veto, but unfortunately it did not meet the required threshold needed to overturn a presidential veto. Thankfully, in 2003, Senator Rick Santorum would reintroduce a ban on partial birth abortion in the Senate. The bill would be supported by members of both parties, and on November 5, 2003, it would be signed into law by President George W. Bush. Contraception doesn't prevent abortion. Contraception doesn't prevent abortion refers to the idea that, well, contraception doesn't prevent abortion. Numerous studies have shown that between a quarter and half of all abortions happen because of contraceptive failing. Contraception, whether you like it or not, incentivizes people to have sex outside of marriage. As a result, unintended pregnancies are much more likely to happen, which will lead to an increase in abortion. According to the Pew Research Center, a whopping 87% of abortions come as a result of fornication. In addition to that, numerous studies have pointed out that abortion does not decrease with increased contraception, but rather due to things like cutting taxpayer funding for abortion, requiring parental consent for abortions involving minors, and other restrictions on abortion. Abolitionists Rising. Abolitionists Rising is another major U.S. anti-abortion group. Founded several years ago, the group stands for the total abolition and criminalization of abortion. The group has criticized the currently existing laws on abortion in states like Louisiana, Texas, and their native Oklahoma for being too lenient on the women who kill their babies through abortion. As the name suggests, they take their strategic and theological cues from the American and British abolitionists of the mid-1800s. They separate themselves from other anti-abortion groups in their stance that all parties involved in abortion should be prosecuted, not just the abortionist. The group has almost 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, and most of their videos consist of their leader, Russell Hunter, engaging pro-aborts either on college campuses or in other public areas. God of Shepherds. God of Shepherds is a song from the Christian metal band The Saving and is the first track off their 2014 album, David's Star. Let's listen to the breakdown right here.
Abortion is murder, and every tongue in support will be an accomplice of such a horrid crime is murder, and every tongue in support will be an accomplice of such a horrid crime is murder. Who are you to say who is healthy enough is to be worthy to live? Abortion is murder, so get on the right side of history and take a stand for humanity!
Pretty brutal, right? Forced abortion in China. Forced abortion has a terribly long history in the People's Republic of China. This epidemic of forced abortion began as a result of the implementation of the one-child policy, which is once again another example of how fears of overpopulation can be used to justify the murder of innocent human beings. Beginning in 1980, the policy required that the vast majority of families within the PRC only have one child. Enforcement varied from province to province. In some parts of the country, the punishment for having more than one child would consist of financial penalties. But in other parts of the country, women would be forcefully sterilized or have their second child murdered in utero. One example of this was Feng Jianmei. In 2012, Jianmei was pregnant for the second time, and local family planning officials tried to persuade her to abort. When she refused to do so, she was kidnapped, and her 7-month preborn child was murdered after being injected with poison. This story spread like wildfire, both within and outside of China. Several years later, the one-child policy would be amended to a two-child policy, before then being replaced by a free-child policy, and then being completely abolished altogether. But while the one-child policy is now a thing of the past, that does not mean that forced abortion has been done away with in China. In the province of Xinjiang, where the population predominantly consists of Uyghur Muslims, the central government has been forcing abortion on Uyghur women in order to curtail the group's birth rates and make it easier for them to be a minority in their own homeland. Abortion in Latin America. With Latin America being a largely Catholic area of the world, abortion is generally much less common and much more frowned upon than in the United States. However, limits on abortion still differ from country to country. In El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, abortion has been completely abolished. However, there are also countries like Colombia, Cuba, and Argentina where it is legal up until a certain point in the pregnancy. In the last country, Argentina, it is currently legal, but President Javier Milei has vowed to recriminalize murder in utero. Let's all pray that takes place. Secular pro-life. Secular pro-life is a pro-life group which seeks to advance the pro-life cause through a secular lens. According to their website, they argue that since preborn children are humans, they possess human rights and thus deserve equal treatment under the law. While the group is not affiliated with any religion in particular and is led by a board of atheists, according to their website, they have members from all kinds of religious backgrounds, including New Agers, Jews, Buddhists, and Christians. Level 6. Jane's Revenge. Jane's Revenge is a pro-abortion terrorist group that aims to eradicate all opposition to abortion within the United States. This group first emerged right after the Dobbs v. Jackson SCOTUS ruling was leaked to the press. On May 8th, the group published its first communique after it attempted to firebomb a crisis pregnancy center in Madison, Wisconsin. In its first blog post, they demanded that all crisis pregnancy centers close their doors and that all anti-choice groups disband. Now, this obviously didn't happen because duh, and so Jane's Revenge would proceed to commit acts of arson and vandalism against pro-life establishments in the states of Maryland, Washington, Oregon, Florida, Iowa, New York, North Carolina, Michigan, Colorado, Virginia, California, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Ohio. The group is decentralized with no singular leader. Last year, several pro-abortion terrorists from this group were convicted, ironically enough, of violating the FACE Act, with one even facing up to 10 years behind bars. Criminalization of pro-life activism in the United Kingdom. As many of those who are watching may know, freedom of speech is not nearly as protected in the United Kingdom as it is in the United States. A major example of this would be the criminalization of peaceful pro-life activism in Great Britain. Abortion would be first legalized up to 28 weeks in 1967 with the passage of the Abortion Act of 1967 under the government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. For several decades, this law only applied to England, Scotland, and Wales, and abortion remained illegal in Northern Ireland. However, that would change when legal abortion was expanded into Northern Ireland in 2020. Currently, all major UK political parties, with the exception of Reform UK and the DUP, are explicitly pro-abortion. While pro-life activism hasn't been entirely banned in the country, there are numerous restrictions placed on those who wish to advocate for preborn children that blatantly contradict the ideals of free speech and freedom of assembly. In Scotland, for example, it is illegal to so much as engage in silent prayer outside of an abortion mill. Similar laws are on the books in England and Wales. George Klopfer. George Klopfer was a German-American abortionist. He was born on August 28, 1940 in Nazi Germany, and when he was just a toddler, he would experience the mass-scale bombing of Dresden by the Allies. After gaining his medical degree from the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, he would spend the next several decades killing preborn children through abortion in the states of Indiana and Illinois. He would pass away on September 3, 2019. Several days later, his extended family would go into his house in order to clean it out and comfort his grieving widow. What they found was horrifying. They would stumble upon thousands and thousands of fetal remains located in numerous boxes and in the trunk of his car. These were the bodies of dead children whose lives were stolen from them by Klopfer, and he treated them like they were trophies. If you want to find out more about this disgusting case, I would highly recommend this podcast by Live Action. Kermit Gosnell. Kermit Gosnell is an abortionist and serial killer from the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He first opened up his abortion mill in 1972. In the following decades, he would kill thousands of unborn babies. But this was no ordinary abortionist. No, he was far worse. In addition to performing early-term abortions, he would also perform illegal late-term abortions on healthy, viable, preborn babies. Worst of all, he would additionally be responsible for the murders of free babies who were born alive as a result of his botched abortions, who would have their spines snipped by Gosnell and would be left to die in agony. Along with that, he would kill 2 women who received abortions from him, Samika Shaw and Karnamaya Monger. He would spend decades engaging in rampant malpractice in his abortion mill, located in one of the poorest inner cities in the United States. Numerous complaints were made against his facility, but the Pennsylvania Department of Health refused to launch a full-scale investigation into him, and they consistently looked the other way. Finally, in 2010, his abortion mill would be raided by the FBI. This initial raid had nothing to do with abortion, ironically enough, and was rather because the federal government suspected that Gosnell was illegally prescribing certain drugs to his patients. What law enforcement saw was nothing less than a house of horrors, complete with third-world conditions. The stench of urine was thick in the air. Cat feces were littered all over the stairs. Many of the medications that he was prescribing were well past their expiration date. The remains of dead babies were stored in the most disgusting conditions imaginable. Some were found in bags. Some were found in milk jugs. Some were found in orange juice cartons. The surgical rooms inside of the facility were so filthy that they were described as resembling, quote, a bad gas station restroom. Investigators estimate that about 10 to 20% of all the fetal remains in the facility belonged to preborn children that were older than 24 weeks, meaning that they had been illegally aborted or really murdered by Gosnell. Gosnell, unlike the vast majority of abortionists, would be charged for his crimes against women and children. After a trial that lasted several years, he would be convicted on charges of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, distribution of controlled substances, maintaining a place for the illegal distribution of controlled substances, 3 counts of first-degree murder, 21 counts of performing illegal late-term abortions, and 211 counts of violating Pennsylvania's 24-hour informed consent law. He would end up narrowly avoiding the death penalty, only being sentenced to life in prison after he waived his right to appeal. He is currently serving his life sentence inside the Huntington State Correctional Facility. Sex-selective abortion. Sex-selective abortion is the practice of killing a preborn child in utero based off of its sex. As we mentioned earlier, this is a major problem in places like China, where for decades there were laws restricting how many children you could have. And since sons were highly preferred in Chinese culture, parents would often kill their preborn child once they found out that it would be a baby girl. This is truly one of the worst forms of violent misogyny in the modern day. Eclipse of Reason. Eclipse of Reason is a 1987 documentary on abortion that was produced by Bernard Nathanson. This was made in response to claims by pro-aborts that his first film, Silent Scream, was propagandistic. This film, rather than focusing on an early-term abortion like in Silent Scream, instead depicts a late-term abortion in graphic detail. And unlike in Silent Scream, where the abortion is depicted in black and white, this one is depicted in vivid color. It also talks about the many health complications that women may face after aborting their preborn children. It is quite graphic and quite hard to watch. Fetal organ harvesting. Fetal organ harvesting is one of the most gruesome aspects of the abortion industrial complex. This is where preborn babies are killed through abortion and then have their organs harvested to be used for medical research. This is being conducted at multiple facilities across the U.S., including the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Pittsburgh. For more info, you can go to our page on fetal organ harvesting here. Partial birth abortion still happens in America. Now, as I previously mentioned in the video, partial birth abortion is banned in the United States under the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2003. However, that does not mean that PBA is non-existent in our country. For one, there are places like the Washington Surgical Clinic where there is strong evidence to suggest that they are still performing partial birth abortions. In addition to that, late-term abortions are still legal in several states. And in order to get around the PBA ban, abortionists will inject the same lethal injection chemicals that we use to execute prisoners into preborn children. Autism-based abortion. So before we get into the issue of autism-based abortion, we need to talk about Autism Speaks. Autism Speaks is the group founded in 2005, which claims to advocate for autistic people. In reality, however, that could not be further from the case. Autism Speaks advocates for research to find a quote-unquote cure for autism, as if it's some kind of debilitating illness and not just a neurological difference. In the late 2000s, the group ran a series of PSAs titled I Am Autism, where the condition is compared to pediatric AIDS and cancer. At around the same time, they released a short video called quote-unquote Autism Every Day. About 4 minutes into the video, they include an interview from a woman who talks about how she wanted to kill her autistic child by driving her off a bridge. For several years, the group had ties to an institution known as the Judge Rottenberg Center. In this facility, autistic children are given electroshock therapy and are deprived of food in order to incentivize quote-unquote good behavior. In 2013, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture declared that the facility had violated the United Nations Convention Against Torture. So basically, the Judge Rottenberg Center is like Guantanamo Bay, but instead of torturing terrorists, they torture children with special needs. Lastly, Autism Speaks has been announced by groups like the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, with some even labeling them as a hate group. Okay, so we know that Autism Speaks is bad, but what does this have to do with abortion? Well, you see, Autism Speaks is the co-founder of Missing, a project with the goal to collect the DNA of more than 10,000 autistic children. The purpose of this database is to identify quote-unquote autism genes to be used for prenatal testing. As we already know, prenatal testing is already being used to eradicate people with Down syndrome in places like Denmark and Iceland. And if prenatal testing for autism becomes widely adopted, then it is almost certain that this will happen to preborn children who are diagnosed with autism. As someone who is on the autism spectrum, I want to make this absolutely clear. So long as I live, I will not let these evil bastards take people with my condition out of the human family. Autistic people deserve love and sympathy, and they do not deserve to be killed through abortion before they even have a chance to succeed at life. Race-based abortion. Racism has been one of the main motivating factors behind the abortion industrial complex for almost all of its history. As we know from earlier in the video, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist who had ties to white supremacists like Lathrop Stoddard. And we've already talked about things like forced abortions on indigenous women in Canada. But while race-based abortion has an ugly history in North America, that trembles in comparison to the horrific race-based abortion policies of Nazi Germany. In the Third Reich, abortion was illegal for any woman who was deemed to be a member of the Aryan race. However, when it came to those who did not fit into this arbitrary racial category, the opposite was the case. When it came to Jewish women and Slavic women, abortion was not only legal throughout any point in the pregnancy, but it would be encouraged. In the ghettos of Poland and other areas of Eastern Europe, all births were illegal, making abortion mandatory for all pregnant women. If a Jewish child was born, the punishment would be for the whole family to be executed. As a result, Jewish doctors were often forced into killing preborn children. Gisela Perl, a gynecologist who survived Auschwitz, said the greatest crime an inmate could commit in Auschwitz was being pregnant. Now, some pro-aborts might argue that since the Nazis banned abortion for some German women, that somehow makes them anti-abortion. This isn't true whatsoever. If you are anti-abortion, you oppose abortion for every race and ethnicity. If you think that it should be illegal for one race to kill their children through abortion, but then encourage one race to do it, then you are pro-abortion, plain and simple. And members of the modern-day neo-Nazi movement have not distanced themselves from their predecessors' support of abortion. Richard Spencer, one of the most well-known modern-day white supremacists, has made statements supporting abortion numerous times. He's been quoted as saying, quote-unquote, "The people who are having abortions are generally very often black or Hispanic or from very poor circumstances." And that it is only, quote, "the unintelligent and blacks and Hispanics," he claims, quote, "who use abortion as birth control," unquote. There is also Amler Fisher, a pseudonymous writer for Spencer's online publication Radix Journal, who defended abortion by saying, quote, "The only ones who can't avoid an unwanted pregnancy are the least intelligent and responsible members of society, women who are disproportionately black, Hispanic, and poor." The worst joke in legal history. Alright, since the last couple of entries have been quite grim and dark, I've decided to end things off on a bit of a lighter note. So this entry, the worst joke in legal history, refers to remarks made by the Assistant Attorney General of Texas, Jay Floyd. Before he began to argue in front of the Supreme Court in defense of Texas's abortion restrictions, he prefaced his remarks with a joke aimed at complimenting Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, his opposing counsel, who are arguing against Texas's abortion restrictions. Let's listen to his little joke.
Mr. Chief Justice, please report. It's an old joke, but when a man argues against two beautiful ladies like this, they're going to have the last word.
So if you can't tell already, the joke fell flat, so much so that it was considered the worst joke in legal history. I would argue that the Roe decision itself actually holds that title, but that's besides the point. So next time that you make a joke that doesn't land well, just remember that at least it wasn't so bad that it led to the deaths of millions of unborn children. Whew, so that does it for the day. Thank you if you managed to watch this thing to the very end. I sincerely appreciate it. If this video motivated you to get involved in the pro-life movement, you can get involved using the link here. If you want to learn more about survivors and what we do, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or you can follow our Instagram at thesurvivors.us. May God bless all of you and may God save the unborn.